Hello and welcome to this new segment I'm trying called The Last 5 Films Within the Last Week or So That I've Seen Briefly Reviewed. Yeah, I'm trying to workshop that title. But basically, what I'm going to do in this segment is I'm going to review the last 5 films that I've seen, but don't really have enough to say about them to warrant a longer review. I guess that's it, so I guess we should just get started. The first film I'll talk about is The Secret Life of Pets 2. And it was pretty bland. Now, I wasn't a huge fan of the first film, namely because the plot was just so generic. I mean, it was basically Toy Story just with pets. But anyway, we're not talking about that boring film, we're going to be talking about this boring film. Probably the biggest criticism with it is that rather than just tell one overarching plot, this film is actually 3 short films, all with relatively equal screen time, until they briefly converge for the climax, and none of them on their own are worth the feature-length treatment. The only one that's actually kind of interesting is the one where Gidget pretends to be a cat to try to get into a cat lady's apartment. But like I said, there just wasn't enough material to merit it being on the big screen. Probably the highlight of the film is Harrison Ford, who is just so comically serious that he manages to elicit most of the film's laughs. And even though the film is mostly dull, I suppose it's harmless enough. I mean, there's not really any bad lessons or obnoxious moments or anything like that. It's just that this film isn't memorable at all. And thankfully the movie is very short, so it just kind of comes and goes by really quickly. And I guess give it this, it fails in a completely different way than the original did, so I guess it has that going for it. So yeah, it's not good, and I wouldn't recommend it, unless you desperately needed something to keep your kids quiet for 80 minutes. Next up on the chopping block is Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. This film was directed by Kiefer Sutherland in what would be one of his very few attempts at directing. And yeah, it's not hard to see why. While he does do a decent job at staging the shootouts, he lacks a clear voice. This film was made during the time when up-and-coming filmmakers were desperately trying to copy Quentin Tarantino, but without the skill and talent needed to pull it off. Overall, this film is just boring. The pacing is just sluggish without any rhyme or reason for it. Most of the characters aren't really all that likable or compelling, so there's no characters to gravitate towards. The film has this kind of semi-interesting subplot about a couple that the criminals take hostage, and how the boyfriend starts to empathize with and emulate his captors, which could be interesting, but the direction his story takes just doesn't feel earned. This film is mostly just boring crime movie cliches that offers nothing new that makes the story feel fresh at all. If you've seen Reservoir Dogs, then you've seen this film, right down to including Seinfeldian conversations that have nothing to do with the plot, although Kiefer Sutherland is clearly having a blast playing the sociopath of the group. So now let's take a look at The Party, a Blake Edwards directed comedy starring Peter Sellers. Now this film is actually quite interesting because apparently this film has a very short script, and most of the film is just Peter Sellers doing improv and having the other actors bounce off of him, and yet you never know it by watching the film. The finished product just feels so incredibly cohesive. I would hesitate to call this film hilarious, but there are a lot of amusing moments. Peter Sellers is a very talented comedian, and he brings a lot to this film and his role. Plus, the fact that he managed to play a bumbling Indian and yet not come across as an offensive and mean-spirited caricature is actually quite impressive. And there are a lot of impressive comedic set pieces, including the final one that involves the house becoming completely covered in soap that is the highlight of the film. This film may not quite reach the heights to be considered a comedy classic. It's not quite funny or consistent enough for that, but there is definitely a lot to admire and appreciate about this film. It's an incredible showcasing of both Peter Sellers and Blake Edwards' talent and is quite the entertaining ride. Now diving into the more obscure films, we have In Like Flynn, a film that's meant to be a semi-fictionalized account of Errol Flynn's life prior to becoming an actor. And it's very clear that Mr. Flynn deserved a much better movie than this. The filmmakers are obviously trying to pay homage to the adventure films of yesteryear, especially the kind of swashbuckling adventure films that Errol Flynn himself would star in, but there's a couple of problems here. The first is that the characterizations are incredibly scant. Everyone is a stereotype here. One character in particular is a blatant ripoff of Quint from Jaws, and not much is given in terms of depth of character. The second is that the film's presentation is just dull. Honestly, I think if you wanted the film to stand out, they would have benefited from trying to capture the style of 1940s adventure films. It would have helped give the film an identity, and you'd have a good reason to do so, because it's about the life of one of the leading action heroes of that era. But instead, the film's directing is just standard and is shot and edited exactly like a film would be today. I would like to see this kind of old-fashioned adventure film genre make a comeback, but this film just doesn't satisfy that craving. And for our final film of the evening, let's take a look at one of the least popular wide releases from last year, Dog Days, and marvel at how surprisingly decent it was. I was going in expect this to be just kind of forgettable fluff, and I was pleasantly surprised at how charming and likable the film was. I usually find with these hyperlink films that I always find one story that stands out above the rest as being clearly superior in comparison, which winds up dragging the rest of the film down, but here that wasn't the case. Bizarrely, all the plots and subplots are at a relatively equal level in terms of entertainment value, which greatly helps this film feel like a consistent product. I was also surprised at how funny this film was. There were actually several moments where I was legit laughing. I was even caught off guard by some subtle jokes that weren't relentlessly shoved into the viewer's face. The characters are decently defined, all the plots progress naturally, and the film is overall just kinda charming and likable. Are there times where it gets a little too schmaltzy? Yes. Is it predictable? Also yes. But in general, the presentation is just so likable that it's hard to hate. And in the end, the film won me over. For those that like romantic comedies and for dog lovers, this is a cute and enjoyable diversion that hits precisely where it's aiming at, even if it doesn't aim any higher. And yeah, I guess that's it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please consider giving it a like and share. If you have any films you'd like to see me cover, please let me know in the comment section down below. Have a good day, and I'll see you next time.